There's often talk that the current Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is not the most accurate gauge of inflation. Well, our next guest is an economist who has been tracking the CPI for decades and is now calculating the accurate, or what he believes is the accurate measure of inflation using methodology that the government used to use in the past. And according to his calculations, inflation should be a lot higher than what is currently represented in the financial reportings from the BLS. John Williams is an economist and the founder of ShadowStats, and he joins us today. John, it's an honor to have you on Kitco. Welcome to the show. It's your first time.
Thank you, David, very much for having me.
My pleasure. Let's take a look at your first chart, John. On ShadowStats, your website, you've presented various charts of your findings on what you believe inflation should be right now. The blue line is the Shadow Government Stats Alternative CPI Index, which you've calculated. And according to the blue line, inflation should be near in the double digits, near 15%, which is substantially higher than the 5.4% headline inflation that we've received from the BLS in the latest June readings. Tell us about this blue line and how you've calculated this, John.
Well, I used to be just sort of a standard economist, and I had my own models on the economy and sold forecasts of same. But in the early 80s, the government started to change the numbers, and we were just reporting the numbers as traditionally seen and such. That's one thing. But what they did at the Bureau of Labor Statistics was that let me back off. Nixon went off the gold standard back in 71. Up through that point in time, you'd find gold and inflation pretty much in the United States ran hand in hand. After Nixon went off, took us off the gold, the inflation began to pick up more than we had seen. We're no longer tied to gold. Gold prices were rising. In the early 80s, the inflation rate had gotten to a point that it meant there had to be some fairly hefty cost of living adjustment measures. The boost in the cost of living adjustment measures. And that would mean more government spending, a greater budget deficit. And somebody had the clever idea, well, really, we're overstating inflation here. Why don't we refigure it a little bit, and we can reduce the headline inflation, which is exactly what they did. What they went after was a component of the housing cost. And at the time, the cost of housing, which is a major portion of the CPI, included such factors as the cost of buying a new home. Now, that was not by any way stretch of imagination the whole thing, but it was part of the calculation. And what they did was they just redefined the series to, instead of measuring actual costs, to measure the cost of homeowners' equivalent rent, which was defined by what a homeowner would pay himself to rent his house to himself. And the inflation was calculated by how much that homeowner would then raise the rent on himself each month. Absolute bogus number, had very little relationship with the reality. But as the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimated it knocked roughly 1.5 percentage points off the aggregate, the total CPI inflation in a year. And that's cumulative going forward. And as time went along, there were changes made with substitution effects. For example, in the mid 90s, most of the changes here were made through the mid 90s. Alan Greenspan would argue, for example, well, if you have steak and the steak gets too expensive, people are going to buy more chicken. So you really should shift the weighting from steak to chicken in the index. And while that might make some sense from measuring certain economic elements, it does not measure anything accurately from the standpoint of what used to be the cost of living. The CPI, before they started changing it effectively was the measure of maintaining a constant standard of living. And if you have to shift from steak to chicken, that's not maintaining a constant standard of living. But by shifting the weights, you could reduce the overall CPI. The effect here over time, from the early part of the 80s into the mid 90s, is an aggregate change of roughly 7.5, 8 percentage points that got knocked off the headline CPI. So that where you see today's CPI running at, it's elevated right now because of the big money supply boost the Fed's been putting out. But I think they've got it up at 5.4% right now.
Yes.
Which is a 13-year high, but it's minimally 0.2% away from being a 41-year high. Cost of living adjustment for the third quarter, it's where it's calculated each year. That's probably going to be a 40-year high. It's about time for them to start monkeying around a little bit with the CPI calculations again. If this is going to be a persistent inflation problem, which I think it is, it's going to get actually quite a bit worse. So that where the government's number was at 5.4%, my estimate was up around 13.5% or such.
You mentioned that the inflation index was changed a couple of times in the last 4 to 5 decades. Do you think that the government at the time, you said that the government reports indicated that they had overstated inflation. Do you think they had a political incentive to start understating inflation?
Oh, sure. It reduced the cost of living adjustment. And with that, the budget deficit. If they could keep down the cost of living adjustments, it would give them a better reading in terms of their shortfall in spending. If the cost of living was up sharply, that was more the government had to lay out, and you'd get a greater deficit. And to give you an example, you saw that again in the 90s. That's when it really came to head as being very heavily political. I know it was political back in the 80s. I mean, I was tracking it then. But you had just somebody do a simple Google search on Gingrich and the CPI, and you'll find all sorts of articles there. Where, for example, Newt Gingrich at the time would talk with Catherine Abrams of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. He said, "Well, gee, if you could find your way to change the numbers here, we might find more money for your bureau." It was shameful politically. That's the only reason these changes were made.
Yeah, we're already, according to your calculations, we're already at double-digit inflation. The last time we had official double-digit inflation per government statistics, as you know, was in the 70s. And then the Federal Reserve responded by raising interest rates to double digits as well. Was that going to happen this time, you think?
Well, it's an unusual circumstance. Back in those days, the Fed had better control of its system. Right now, you're in the middle of an extraordinary crisis. The pandemic shut down the economy is really, really unprecedented. The federal government, have been doing everything they can to keep the system afloat, solvent, people as stable as possible in terms of their financial condition. And the Fed has just created money beyond any scope ever seen before in modern U.S. history. If you look at the standard measures of the money supply, and the Fed's been playing some games here. Mm-hmm. It used to be the narrowest measure was money supply M1, which is basically cash and checking accounts. Then you go to M2, where you'd add in savings deposits and such. And then you had a broader M3, which the Fed hasn't published for some time. I still estimate it. Right. But what you've seen is that in this crisis, there's been a flight to liquidity. If you look at the broadest M3, its year-to-year change is at an all-time high, but it may be down around 20% or so. Uh, M2's getting up around 30% all-time high. And where initially coming into as the crisis broke, we saw M1 soar to over 70%. Nothing ever like that ever seen here. The Fed decided to redefine M1, and it just effectively redefined it as M2,
Yes.
which had the savings accounts in it. You put the savings accounts in it, all of a sudden, M1 now, viewed on what as close as you can get to consistent basis, is up somewhat over 30%. It is, again, on the basis of the current definition, an all-time high. But I've come back and I'm introducing, or I've introduced, not that it's a new concept, but I'm publishing it, what I call basic M1. And basic M1 is close to what the old M1 was. It's cash plus checking accounts. That was the original money supply measure in 1948, and that's what it was until into the 70s, early 70s. The only difference between that and the old M1 is that the old M1 also had other checkable accounts. But the Fed, in its redefinition, combined that with the savings accounts it was taking out of the non-M1, M2, and you can no longer separate it out. But still, where the old M1 is now about 93% of M2, where before it was something like 13% of M2, my basic money supply, which is again the cash and the checking accounts, most liquid element. That's 83% of the old M1, and what you're seeing is there. You've just gone month after month with record soaring year-over-year change, and I say year-over-year change. What you have to keep in mind here is that we've been in an extraordinarily long period of time now with the pandemic. The pre-pandemic month at the moment is generally viewed as February of 2020. So that would have been the relative trough of the money supply and the relative peak of most economic activity. So when I would normally look at year-to-year change, but where we've gone beyond the first year and you had such extreme volatility in March and April and May and even June.
So John,
beyond March and after, I'm comparing it with the pre-pandemic level. So that when I say that the M1, the basic M1 is up 81%, that is against the pre-pandemic level of February 2020, and it's continuing to grow. Look at the monetary base; we can still get into. We can get it up through the middle of July, and that's increasing. So I think we're going to see some continued growth here in M1, which you only have through at this point through May. Next week we'll get an estimate for June, but that leads inflation. That's one reason that I'm looking for much higher inflation.
All right, and we'll talk about your inflation forecast in just a minute. So, John, an interesting recent development in the last decade or so is the rise of cryptocurrencies. Now, you're talking about measuring money supply using the most basic form of including only cash and cash equivalents and checking accounts. Do you think going forward in the future, we should also include crypto wallets, things that are invested in Bitcoins or Ethereums or other cryptocurrencies, for example, that aren't in bank checking accounts or don't necessarily count as cash right now, but could potentially be used as a medium of exchange in the future?
Not at present, maybe in some time in the future, but you don't have a stable circumstance right now, and we'll see how it shakes out. Okay. I don't view that as a stable circumstance or one that you'd want to even indicate as an element of your money supply here.
Let's take a look at the next chart on GDP. This is an interesting chart. You've compiled not just statistics for inflation, but also for the gross domestic product. According to your calculations in the blue line, the SGS Alternative Series, the GDP growth throughout the 2000s has actually been negative. That's a surprise. Why do you think that is?
But well, it's a matter of how the numbers are reported, and if you actually survey people, you'll find that the average guy's rarely has bought into some of the economic strength that's been reported here. But the reason for the difference there, again, is inflation. Unlike the CPI, which is more tightly regulated because of its uses and the cost of living adjustment and such. And again, in terms of changes there, I think there's something like 15 changes in that period of time that have been involved. But with the GDP, you don't have such tight political considerations. It generally doesn't. The implicit price deflator in the GDP is not used for adjusting people's cost of living or such. And generally, and there's some benefits to having lower inflation. The weaker inflation that you deflate by, the stronger the real or the inflation-adjusted growth will be. And what you'll see here basically is an understatement of the implicit price deflator, where there have been all sorts of shifts around with substitution. And I mean, this is where you get the chicken substituted for the beef in the inflation numbers. And the lower that is, the understatement of the headline inflation there is basically been about the order of magnitude of the reported real growth. Mm-hmm. So you adjust that out, and basically you've seen a stagnant economy in terms of constant dollars, which is the way it's measured.
Okay, and before we move on, John, do you think this phenomenon of stagnant growth can only be applied to the U.S.? I mean, I know you don't specialize in statistics for other countries, but just based on your observation, do you think the rest of the world has been stagnating as well over the last 11 years?
Not as much. And you can see that in our burgeoning trade deficit. That's if you have a strong trade surplus, that's a sign that you've got a good economy.
Okay. Do you think that's a result of government policy, or private sector is shifting their priorities to becoming more of an import-oriented economy?
Well, it's a combination of both. There are a lot of things in the way of government policies that can make life more expensive for businesses, and they find it maybe easier to move offshore, and we can produce goods cheaper offshore.
Sure.
There's a whole spectrum of things that affect how that goes, but generally our trade deficit has been continuing to deteriorate, and that's a direct subtraction from the GDP numbers. But those that's in the headline numbers. My difference between what you see there and the official reporting is due basically to the what I would consider to be a realistic inflation number for the GDP against the implicit price deflator they use.
Okay. All right. Now let's talk about the next chart here. This is a scary chart. Unemployment. So according to your estimates, the unemployment rate is still above 35, well, has reached over 35% and is still above 25%. So according to your definition, a quarter of our nation, well, not the nation, but a quarter of our workforce, the labor force, is not currently employed. How is that possible?
Well, these are three separate measures of employment. The bottom line, that's the headline unemployment rate. And the way that's defined is that to be counted as
that's
unemployed.
What the government uses, right? Just to be clear, that's what the government shows.
That's the monthly number that comes out of the federal government. And in order to be counted as unemployed, you have to be actively looking for a job.
Correct.
And that's their definition. The next line up is what they call U6. That's the broadest measure that they publish, and then they include in that discouraged workers. And that's probably one of the biggest elements. But these are not people who are a discouraged worker, someone who'd like to have a job, but he's not. He wants a job, but he's not actively working, so he doesn't get counted in the headline unemployment rate. This all changed. If you go back in time, you see, I start my number 1994. That's when you had NAFTA. That's when they redefined the series. NAFTA went into effect, and at the time, the broadest measure in terms of the discouraged worker didn't have a time limit. In the current numbers, if you're a discouraged worker, you want a job, but you can't find a job. There are no jobs available. That's the way they express it. Prior to the redefinition, as long as that was the circumstance, you were counted as a discouraged worker. It could be discouraged for 4 years. It didn't make any difference. It just counted you as a discouraged worker. After the redefinition, if you were discouraged for more than a year, they no longer counted you as being discouraged. So that what you see there is a difference. The difference between my number and the middle line, which is it's the official broadest measure of the government's unemployment rate as it stands now, as defined since 1994. The difference between that line and my line is a continued buildup of long-term discouraged work. These are people who would like to work, they just can't find a job, and they've been discouraged for more than a year. It's not limited to being discouraged for a year. So that's the difference.
Okay.
So my measure is it's long-term unemployment, including long-term discouraged workers.
Well, no matter how you look at it, John, the fact is the unemployment rate, depending on whichever measure you use, is still at multi-decade highs. Just using your forecast and your knowledge here, do you think that this unemployment rate is likely to come back down and retrace to historical mean levels? Or do you think that this elevation is here to stay for quite some time?
Well, it depends how quickly you're going to have a real economic recovery. And if you could go back to that chart for just a second.
Yes.
Just look at that bottom line for a minute. You've had Fed Chairman Powell indicate that headline unemployment is understated. I think he's estimated it up around 10%, which as the Bureau of Labor Statistics defines it, is probably reasonably good estimate. What you're seeing here is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics can't count the number of unemployed ever since the pandemic hit. What they found is that their survey people keep misclassifying certain unemployed people as being in a category where they would not be counted they're counted as unemployed. They should be counted as employed because of the nature of their unemployment. And they publish the numbers, and it's running maybe, well, now it's about 0.2% higher. I think it used to be 0.5% higher. But there are a lot of problems with the survey at present. There are a lot of problems with even surveying inflation right now, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics can't send its normal people out in the field to measure things. So you have to be a little careful with the numbers that we're seeing right now. They may eventually be revamped, but good bet that the headline unemployment as reflecting it is higher than is being headlined. Same thing's true with the headline CPI. We'll see how they adjust that over time.